Now that number, because I think you just said it was 0.8 grams per kilogram, was your recommended amount, which is like the maximum that anyone in the world basically needs.
Now, typically what I do with protein is about 1.25 grams per pound of body weight.
What's going on YouTube? It's Jason, and today we're going to address the question, how much protein do you actually need? Now, there's so much conflicting information about this, and it's very difficult to find an accurate answer, simply because most of the people giving out the information have an agenda. You've got those in the eat less meat camp that are trying to recommend the minimal amount of protein you can get away with, and then you've got bodybuilders and supplement company owners that are trying to tell you to stuff your faces with protein. In honesty, the answer lies somewhere in between, and we're going to explore that in this video. But before we start, I thought I'd clear up some protein myths, as there are a lot of them. Myth number 1, too much protein makes you fat. Wrong. Too many calories makes you fat. Once a person has exceeded their calorie intake, it doesn't really matter whether they're consuming chicken or pasta or broccoli, you're going to gain weight. No single food group, not even carbs, makes you fat. It's more about your daily calorie intake. Number 2 is the anabolic window, the 30 minutes to an hour after training when protein magically does more than any other time of the day. Now, this myth has been around for at least 2 decades. It was there when I started training. But when you look into the science, your total daily protein intake is far more important than the anabolic window. There is no real anabolic window as long as your total protein intake for the day is adequate. Take some protein every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day and you'll be absolutely fine. Myth number 3, too much protein is bad for your kidneys. Wrong. Unless you have an underlying kidney problem that will cause your kidneys to work harder, the vast majority of healthy adults don't need to worry about their protein intake. If you're healthy, your body and kidneys in particular are going to do what they need to do. Myth number 4, and I hear this with most of the clients I train, but you don't need protein if you're not training. Once again, this is utterly ridiculous because the vast majority of the strengthening, growth, and repair of your muscles happen when you're not training. So my advice is, whether or not you're taking a protein supplement, keep your protein intake constant, whether you're training or not. Myth number 5, and this might ruffle a few feathers, but not all protein is created equal. With this whole eat less meat campaign, we're made to believe that no matter where you get your protein from, it's absolutely fine. But when you look into the science, animal proteins and dairy do have a far superior amino acid profile to other forms of protein. That's not to say that you can't get those amino acids in plant-based products, but you have to work a lot harder. Let's be honest, the average person is not going to go through the effort to complement proteins to get their amino acid profile. And because of this laziness, in my experience, those who are plant-based tend to not get enough protein. And the final myth is that your body can't consume more than 30 grams of protein in one sitting. Now again, this myth has been around since I started training, but when you look into the science, it's not necessarily true for 2 reasons. The first is that protein requirements vary based on your weight and lean body mass, which we'll go into in a bit. So someone who's 100 kilos will be consuming more protein than someone who's 50 kilos. So the 100 kilo person, based on their lean body mass, will literally need double the protein intake per meal than the 50 kilo person. And the second thing is that your body uses protein for a lot more than protein synthesis and maximizing muscle growth. Things like supporting brain function, helping your immune system, and helping with injuries in tissue and cell repair. So don't worry, if you go to a steakhouse and consume 80 grams of protein in one sitting, your body's gonna find something to do with the extra protein. Cool, now we've cleared that up, how much protein do we actually need? So let's start by recommendations, or what is deemed to be adequate daily protein intake. The recommendations currently stand at 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. But what does the recommended daily protein intake actually mean, and who is it for? The recommended daily protein intake is the amount of protein deemed to be sufficient to not fall short of protein and avoid adverse health effects. Remember I said that protein supports immune function, so someone who's consuming too little protein is at greater risk of infection and disease. So yeah, those recommendations are enough to just keep the lights on in your body, but it's by no means optimal when it comes to things like health, performance, or improving your body composition. The second you introduce things like training or muscle building and strength goals, these numbers should change. Factors like age, gender, muscle mass, and activity levels are all going to influence your protein intake. So when we take into account the recommendations, along with the scientific research on protein, it's safe to conclude that 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is enough for a sedentary individual. 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is enough to maintain and build muscle mass, and according to science, there are very few downsides with going over 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's not to say that you should, but just that if you do, it's not harmful. And also bear in mind that if you do exceed this number, you're not going to get greater muscle building or strength benefits. So I should probably caveat what I said. Eating too much protein does come with some risk, but a lot of the risks are mitigated when you look into the context. To name just a few examples, eating too much protein does come with an increased risk of kidney stones. But an increased risk to who? People with underlying kidney problems. If you don't have underlying kidney problems, your risk of kidney stones is minimal. Number 2, increased protein for most people does come with increased meat intake, and this in theory increases your risk of cancer. Again, when it comes to cancer and general health risk, not all meats are created equal, so your processed and your red meat would have a higher risk of cancer than your lean white meats. Matter of fact, when you look into the research, there are very few downsides noted with cancer or anything else when we are dealing with lean white meat. So things like turkey or chicken breast, for example, or even white fish. Another thing cited with high protein and the assumed high meat intake is the increased risk of digestive issues. Once again, most of these digestive issues are linked to your beef, pork, and lamb, red meats. So most of the risks cited when it comes to high protein intake are largely eliminated when you remove underlying health conditions and processed and red meat. As in, once you remove these 3 factors, you are pretty much clutching at straws. Now let's go on to the risks of having too little protein. Accelerated loss of bone and muscle mass, which increases your risk of a bone fracture should you fall. Number 2, particularly in young people, insufficient protein can actually stunt your growth. Number 3, and I touched on this on the myths about protein, but a low protein intake can actually weaken your immune system. Amino acids, which is protein in its most basic form, actually help the body develop antibodies to help fight infection. And finally, slower recovery and healing, which can have a negative impact on your strength. So contrary to popular belief, the risks of not getting enough protein are far greater than the risks of getting too much, particularly when you remove the things to do with context. So that's everything. Make sure you're getting enough protein, and as to how much you get, it really depends on whether you just want to keep the lights on and survive, or you want to thrive and actually improve your body composition. Hope you found this video helpful. Don't forget to like it, comment below for the algorithm, please subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.